Hello, this is Father Louis Scurdy back with Vince Begley. You met Vince at a previous episode of Friends of the Word, the Carmelites. Vince is the archivist for Our Lady of Mount Carmel National Shrine in Middletown, New York. And the first episode gave us a little bit of a history of the Irish Carmelites being established here in the United States. But now we're going to go back to further history, to the Irish Rebellion. Thank you, Vince, for agreeing to share this information with us. Okay, describe recently I was in Ireland, and there's not a situation you go into and you don't see or hear people refer to the penal period, the suffering of the Irish. We walked through a workhouse. It's now a museum. We met the Franciscan sisters, Poor Clares, who were chased out of Dublin, chased out of Galway, went someplace else, came back, all during the persecution of the Irish. So tell us about that.
Well, it's a long history. The Irish basically were beginning to lose their identity because when the English had long held the Irish in their control, but there were a number of series of revolutions. In the beginning, the 1798 revolution was not as successful as they had hoped, and it was actually, we think of the Catholics starting all the revolutions.
Okay.
1790 was the Protestants.
Oh.
Because they were Irish, whether they were Catholic or Protestant, they were Irish first. And that failed. And then in 1848, it was called the Young Irelanders Rebellion. That's when the Carmelites became much more involved. 1848, throughout Europe, there were revolutions in Belgium, in Italy, all over Europe, because countries wanted their own sovereignty. And the 1848 rebellion again failed. And throughout the history of the Irish and the English, they closed most of their churches. So the Irish Catholic priests had to go underground, as did the Carmelites.
Right.
They lost their property. It was against the law to say Mass.
We took a tour of one of the castles, and the guide made a point of it was owned by Catholics at that point. The guide made a point of pointing to the beautiful woodwork, and he said, and you don't realize, but this woodwork, so intricate, leads to a room. So you press a particular area and the door opens, and that was where they hid the priests, because they used to go to the castles, say Mass, or gather with people, and when the enemy was coming, they would hide them in these rooms.
And the Irish Carmelites had to go into hiding. They lost many of their properties, and it was during those penal days that they had to go underground. And this here is a small chalice from the penal days, when they would serve Mass in the woods, or they would be in hiding in somebody's barn.
Oh, that's beautiful, isn't it?
It's just one of the relics that is in the archives from that period.
Right. Beautiful. And it just shows the desperation, but yet the need to worship, the need to pray together.
Right, and it was because the Catholics in Ireland still wanted to retain their faith and keep it alive, despite what the English were doing. So after 1848, there was a period, a lull. But what happened was, once the church began to get its property back, the Irish priest, not the orders of like Franciscans or Carmelites, they acquiesced to the English, and they realized we have to maintain some kind of sort of balance here. But the Irish Carmelites said, no, we don't want to do that. So they were in conflict with the
church and the establishment. Right.
And as a result, they would say Mass for those people that were not to be, if they wanted to be buried in the Catholic Church, the diocese churches wouldn't bury them, but the Carmelites would. The Carmelites were serving the people. So
even within the Catholic community there was conflict.
Right. Because the Pope at the time wanted the...
Who was that?
I believe it was Pius Pius the Ninth.
Yes.
Who was against any the Irish freedom movement.
Oh.
And Cardinal Cullen of Ireland was in support of the Pope and just did not want to ruffle the feathers of the English. But the Irish Carmelites were against it. And as a result, when the Irish 1916, the Easter Monday
Yes.
uprising, and Jacob's biscuit factory, 2 Irish Carmelites were actually there. They were the ministers of those who were captured. So they had a sense. They were right there on the firing lines. And from that moment on, they did not waver in their ardent support of the Irish freedom movement.
And if you go to Dublin today, because a lot of that took place around the post office,
Yes.
the bullet holes are still in the walls of the post office, and they make a point of showing them. That was 1916.
There were 2 priests in particular, Carmelites, Father Peter Elias McGuinness and Father Donald Finbar O'Connor. They were both in America at the time. Father McGuinness was going around in 1914, as early as 1914, raising money to send back to Ireland because he knew.
And they were Carmelites.
They were Carmelites. He knew that, although it's not recorded in history because much of what he did not get written down for fear that if it did, people could have proof of his actions.
Sure.
So he was raising money and bringing it back and supplying it. He was the one when the Lusitania was torpedoed, knew that the Lusitania was an armed ship. No one was willing to admit, but he knew because he had information. It wasn't until the 1970s when Life magazine exposed it and showed, yes, that boat was originally built to supply arms to England from America. But Father McGuinness was an ardent fighter for the Irish freedom movement. He went around, he supported it, he raised money. Father O'Connor did the same. They said masses for the Irish martyrs of the 1916 rebellion.
Wow.
And Our Lady of the Scapula became known as really the sort of the Motel 6 for the Irish rebellions. They always left a light on for anyone from Ireland who needed a place to stay.
Isn't that fascinating?
And in the archive,
And that was located downtown.
downtown,
New
28th
York.
Street. It became known as just as 28th Street.
Right.
They shortened it from Our Lady of the Scapula to 28th Street. And in the archives, there is one box that's particular interest to people who were doing history of the Irish Revolution. It's a box, I don't know if it can be seen, that contains note cards from 1916 all the way through to 1923. And these cards contained notes and quotes from any article that was written at the time about the Irish movement.
Here's something by Liam Mellows from 1919. Wow. And various handwritings.
Yes.
And
So
who kept these?
This was kept because they wanted to record what was actually happened. The Carmelites became known as troublemakers in New York City, and they were.
I like them already.
Yeah, their phones were wiretapped. They were being watched by the precursors of the FBI because they were taking people in, like you mentioned, Liam Mellows. Liam Mellows had escaped from Ireland, and he came over to America, and the Carmelites took him in. And not only did they protect him, the violin that's in the archive history room was Liam Mellows. Liam Mellows was
'cause I
hired
saw
to
that.
teach.
Right. Oh.
He taught Irish music, Irish dancing, Irish language courses to the children at Our Lady of Scapula School. And he eventually went back to Ireland and was captured and executed for his role in the Irish Rebellion. They also kept Harry Boland, who is a featured character in the famous movie of Michael Collins.
Right.
Harry Boland came over and he stayed with the Carmelites, and the fact that Carmelites raised money for him that he brought back. And in the archives, there were a series of bonds that were kept. They were members of the Sinn Féin, members of every Irish organization promoting Irish freedom.
1920.
So they, at one time...
Can I see one of these? And this is also a bond?
Yes, all bonds, 2 different periods.
Beautiful.
And the archives have the record books of collections made and the number of checks made out to Harry Boland in support. And not only did they do that, they also were holding and running guns. At one point, they had so many stored guns and ammunition
At the church?
At the church, that they were afraid that the sacristy floor was going to collapse, so they had to support it underneath.
Wow.
So they were very involved when the Irish rebellion turned into the Civil War. The Carmelites were anti-treaty. They did not want to. They sided with the Civil War against the English, but when the treaty was signed, the Irish Carmelites were against it. And primarily because the Irish were very big supporters of Eamon de Valera, who, although born in New York, was raised and lived in Ireland. He became the second president of Ireland. He was very faithful to the Carmelites as they were to him. When he came over to America, they helped him. When he was ill, they brought him up to St. Albert's in Middletown, where they helped nurse him back to health. And when Eamon de Valera died in 1975, because he was such a fond of the Irish Carmelites, he called them 28th Street the cradle of Irish civilization in America.
Wow.
When he died, he was laid out in an Irish Carmelite habit.
Oh, excellent! Almost like a third order.
Yes.
Wow.
But he was.
When we were there a few years ago, we went to the infamous jail. Is it Kilmainham
Yes.
jail? Unbelievable! What they put the prisoners through. I guess it's no less than a Gitmo, but it's hard to believe. And the heroes that were affiliated with Kilmainham, it's unbelievable.
Well, in the archive there is a series of, they call Letters from Prisoners. It's a collection of letters, the Liam Mello's letters that he wrote from jail back to the Irish Carmelites. In his last letter that he wrote to them, asked if the Carmelites would remember his mother and take care of his mother. And then even through 1960, when there was still the Irish struggle for unification of Ireland,
right.
The Irish helped. They have a number of letters from prisoners who, at that date, were still fighting in the struggle.
Amazing.
And Father Isaacson, who was the founder of the archives, he wrote a book called Always Faithful. It's the full history of the New York Carmelites and the Irish, their fight for freedom.
That's fantastic. Beautiful. We took a trip up there. I knew Carol took the position as director of the shrine. So surprised when we got there, but the surprises keep coming. The history affiliated with the Irish Carmelites is just fascinating. I'm so glad you're here, informing us and our audience about the history of the Carmelites in the United States. We're going to pick this up, but I want you to summarize the Good Friday Agreement that eventually brought peace to North and South, the Republic and the North.
Well, at that point, the Irish New York Carmelites were sort of becoming, say, less Irish. They had melded with other people, and the priests who were Carmelites in the beginning, the first 40, 50 years, they were largely Irish Carmelites from Ireland.
Right.
But once they became more Americanized and realized that what was going on in Ireland was not good, they were very much in favor of bringing peace to Ireland. But the Irish Carmelites have played an important role, and they were very faithful to the Irish people, because the people who came here, many of them were descendants of those people who left for the Great Hunger.
Sure.
And many of them who were in other troubles came, and the Irish Carmelites met their needs and helped serve them.
Great. Thank you very much, Vince.
Good, thank you.
I'm here with Vince Begley, and he is the archivist for the National Shrine of Our Lady of Mount Carmel in Middletown, New York. You have to get there. It's a beautiful experience, great grounds. How many acres are up there?
I think it's 16 acres.
It's beautiful. Shrines, and there is a shrine to Our Lady of Knock, and we'll talk about that later. And you'll have a wonderful experience, a spiritual journey, you might say. This has been Father Louis Scurdy with Vince, and wishing you good wishes. Go on to our site to see the history of the Carmelites and the interviews we had. And let me hear from you, fatherlouiscurdy@hotmail.com. And pass this on to your family and friends, especially the Irish members. God bless you.